good partners, really understand that, and that it's best for the organization to let them, preserve a relationship, a good working relationship with the supplier, and really let us kind of unleash the attack dogs, if you may, right?
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite, and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
On this episode of Power Supply, we're going to speak with Rick Gresko, Vice President of Procurement at Jefferson Health. And Hayes, I've known Rick for quite a while, actually a little over a decade. We're both involved with the local ARM chapter in Philadelphia called CPAC. And so seen Rick at the meetings, obviously worked with Jefferson Health in the past, and he has really seen not only his organization grow substantially, but also his role as he oversees purchase services and indirect spend. We're going to be talking about those today, what makes them a little bit unique from each other, and how can you bring value to the table, but also be able to manage these agreements that might have once been seen as a commodity, Hayes.
Oh, absolutely they were. But, like you said, he wraps up almost $1 billion in contracting now. But we get into a whole bunch of spend creep, balls and strikes, watch your back. We have all kinds of good content here today. So hop on and enjoy it today.
All right, we're going to be right back with Rick. Stay with us. Just a short break, and we'll be back.
I'm Hayes Walder.
This is Gary Skinner.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to Power Supply.
All right, joining us now, Rick Gresko, Vice President of Procurement at Jefferson Health. And Rick, you and I have been members of CPAC for, going back over a decade. I've known you for quite a while. And we had another board member on very recently, Jason Isherwood, and he talked about laundry and linen services, which kind of ties into, I'd say, a little bit more broader conversation that we're going to have with you today. It's going to be around purchase services and indirect spend, which are two buzzwords that sometimes I feel like people use interchangeably. We'll start weeding through that in a minute, but I want to welcome you to the show, Rick. Thanks for coming on Power Supply.
Thanks for having me.
This is going to be a fun trip today. I'm excited.
Yeah. I showed up late just for everybody's awareness on the podcast. So Hayes and Gary have Rick all prepped up. I'm waiting for some surprises as we get into this interview. Rick, what did they tell you?
I've never heard this many words of excitement around indirect and purchase services, but I'm encouraged by it.
We can make anything
I wish
fun,
my
Rick.
stakeholders would be this excited when we were talking.
Hey, this is fun stuff. It's impactful.
That's right.
Rick, talk about your background. Tell us, I'm sure your role has evolved at Jefferson over the years.
Yeah, of course. So started out on another side of healthcare, on the pharmaceutical side, in actually our marketing and communications group there. Kind of ventured into sourcing while I was at that. It was a multinational pharmaceutical company, one of the top 10 largest at the time, and spent some time, moving into, contracting and materials management on that side, and was asked back in 2015 if I wanted to come to Jefferson, which was, kind of an emerging and fledgling, organization of three hospital system that rapidly merged and acquired and evolved into what now is an 18 hospital system, 2 university campus enterprise, and 1 payer organization to actually start to create really and build out a indirect, purchase service competency at the enterprise. So been here for 8 years. Like I said, that's, been a really rapid evolution in terms of what we were originally sourcing and contracting, to now, applying that across a much broader and diverse spectrum of business units here.
So purchase services, indirect spend, they've been buzzwords. I'd say, I like to say now, and I probably have said this on a prior podcast, I like to say indirect spend is the new purchase services, because you're just seeing an explosion in consulting engagements around indirect spend. GPOs are getting much more involved in indirect spend as they continue to, put forth additional value versus just, large volume contract pricing and savings opportunities that way. But are they essentially the same thing, or are they mutually exclusive?
Yeah, good point, Justin. I mean, when I think about the services and supply side of what I do, like you said, the services can run the gamut anywhere from, marketing, advertising services to, consulting services, which are, really popular right now, to workforce services, right? To any of the other, kind of clinical services that we have in place. And then on the kind of indirect, right, supply side, we focus, a lot more on, I would say, traditional kind of items like office supplies, right? Laundry and linen, stuff that's really applicable in the healthcare space. Print, our managed print services, but you used to, buy a printer and buy your toner and you'd be set, where now you're kind of wrapping that around a whole, purchase service, right? From a managed service perspective with some of these big, large, print supply companies that, supply both the device and then, kind of wrap in that toner service and replacement service and maintenance service around it. So yeah, I guess to your question, it's one or the other. I think they become interchangeable over the years, but the approach to them, from really looking at moving from some commodity, when you think of them as when you think of them had been historical commodity type purchases, to now more specialized niche services, I think, you could kind of use them interchangeable, if that makes sense.
Rick, I like how you brought up the interchangeable piece of it, but from a procurement standpoint, are you seeing more like, you brought up office supplies and print, I think is really good. Are you seeing more like punch out versus direct to the distributor, to the consumer? I'm looking at more of the controls around it, right? How do you make sure the procurement doesn't get, they're buying so much from an office supply company that should be going into food and nutrition or should be going to another gamut, and it's just open. Are you putting some controls around that as well in the purchase services arena?
Oh yeah, we absolutely are, because I think, spend creep is our worst enemy, right? And we absolutely have to, pay a lot of focused attention to that, because, especially, in the office supply, they still sell you anything, right? Anything from, a pen and a piece of paper to, a whole managed service around your print environment. So yeah, you have to really, kind of segment them, I think, and, kind of really focus on category management at that point, to ensure that you're preventing some of that leakage and, unraveling of, what you really try to bucketize.
Rick, every month I look at my own personal financial, and we have a lot of spend creep going on. You know what I'm saying? It just keeps on growing. And I would love some insight on how you can prevent that.
Yeah, it doesn't work too well in my house either, to be honest with you. So.
Sorry, that makes me feel better.
Can't replicate. Everything's not always replicatable from work to home.
Yeah, okay, just making sure.
I got to imagine the challenge is the same. It's about getting other people to get on board with the plan, right?
The strategy.
I mean, if you,
yes.
The creep isn't always something that, hey, you're singularly spending right? That creep, you've got other people in the household spending that money. So, I feel like wrangling. Rick started this by saying, I wish all the customers I support were as excited about indirect spend and purchase services as you guys are, and I think, you see that same variation in your own household. Some people care. Usually there's one person in the household who cares about the finances and the other one not as much. And so, there's a common dynamic there that I think life imitates work.
Well, I think this is a coaching opportunity from Rick to Hayes on really trying to standardize on really what's happening in his household. He's got spend going everywhere. So, Rick, maybe you take it on that next step.
We like to call it constructive friction, right?
I love it. In the workplace, if someone just really, abused something, they could be fired. At home, it's not so easy.
Doesn't work the same way.
No, it's like, it just doesn't work that way. No, it doesn't.
But in all seriousness, Rick, for our users, not just for Hayes, but for everybody that's listening out there, how do you pull that spend creep in, and what are some directions to maybe look at standardization? I know sometimes you can look at a sole source. Sometimes that's just not the way to go to 90% commitment or whatever that looks like. You've got some things outside of it that's carved out. But how are you approaching your team, and maybe share some best practices in your world that's been, effective?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're getting a lot more insight through data and analytics, to help us quantify and drive a lot of that decision making, right? To really start to bucketize and, to decide strategic approach for commodity based spend and how we manage that versus more specialized, spend and things that fall into niche categories and things that we need to, pay a different amount of focus to versus a, kind of a turnkey solution with a GPO contract or something like that we could really, leverage, but we need to really, explore the market, do some deeper analytics, deeper market intelligence, all data driven, right? That, that kind of help drive us towards what the right decision is from a strategic approach on things like that. So it kind of just orients us, I think, from a focus perspective when we review all that data analytics, right? What's the highest return, on the effort, right? So you quantify things as low effort, high return, right? So it's, you kind of bucketize your commodities in that area, because there's a lot of spend there, but it's a low effort that you're able to really make an impact. And then you kind of look at the other stuff that's, kind of high effort, high return, but that's where you need to, step back and, dig deeper into that data to really tease out a strategy that's going to help you, make that impact. And it's just, it's a heavier lift, but if the return's there, it's, really worth the effort, right? And, you ensure, because it's not commodity based, you kind of have a lot more criteria that you're looking at as you're evaluating all of that, right? Your quality, your service, your innovation, all those kind of metrics that drive, the decision behind that, aside from just price, right? That you're kind of trying to focus on and of course minimize and mitigate, right? But you're pulling in a lot of those other criteria in that evaluation.
I got two questions to kind of follow up on where you're headed with that. You're talking about bringing value to commodity services, right? Like if you really boil it down, and, that's what healthcare needs in a lot of different areas, right? Short-staffed, just need more from your supplier. So there's an opportunity even in categories that might have traditionally been seen as a commodity. There are things that can be brought to the table to kind of be that commodity buster, and it leaves opportunity for companies. And you were, kind of talking about that. I was thinking, especially around printers, that used to be a commodity, but I think the state of IT sourcing and contracting and risk management has now taken that category and made it less of a commodity, because now you're looking at, well, wait a second, we've seen healthcare, hacks originating from a thumb drive that got plugged in to do an update on a printer that was then connected to the network. And all of a sudden we had this big systemic, virus breakout. That changes the commodity situation, right? And so when you start to evaluate your partners, their IT security protocols, their service, all of that is really all under a whole different lens now, is it not?
Oh, absolutely, Justin. Yeah, I think you're on to more there than just that exposure point on kind of the data element to it. That, on print specifically in the clinical environments, you're talking about, HIPAA risks, disclosing patient data, things that you really need to get, the best type of security into and weave it into, kind of it's an interesting conundrum because historically, especially in a clinical environment, everyone would tell you they need their personal printer at their workspace to be able to secure that patient data or patient, personally identifiable data. Well, that's not the case anymore. When you're working with a more sophisticated service provider, they could have secure print functionality enabled on the device, that none of that data is exposed until the person that intended to print it is standing in front of the device, tapping out their personal PIN code, right? Which allows us to then, kind of minimize that footprint of, historically very expensive personal devices and personal networked printers to, kind of multifunction printers, which are much lower operating costs, right? So it helps enable, kind of that, right sizing of our print environment. And we drive it, through that technology. And really another piece of this is policy driven, right? So we're now, putting into place, not just purchasing guidelines, but actually policy behind that in terms of, what the organization will support from a printing perspective. And if there are exclusions, what are they? That it's all documented. So we prevent, again, a lot of that creep in spend and expense. And when we maximize kind of our control around an environment like that. So yeah, it's a heavily complex area, which I think we're making a lot of inroads to, all the while, being able to kind of, again, mitigate the expense around that and just look for, a higher, resilient environment and, kind of optimized expense environment.
It's also interesting because I'd say most of sourcing 20 years ago was really focused on mostly procedural, right? And even then, when you talk to people who work in supply chain, even with more of that more limited clinical scope, they would sit there and talk about how they had to become experts in the technology or the device and really understanding that. It's interesting because it's really not any different in non-clinical or indirect spend. Now you have to become an expert in printers and copiers. It really doesn't matter what the product is, does it? It's just you're separating clinical and non-clinical from each other so that there are some commonalities in, contract types and considerations and the end users that you're supporting, at different facilities and departments.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Because I initially used to think of it as the old analogy, that you're 50 feet wide and 2 inches deep, right? Where, now when you're, kind of fighting these battles and working through, sourcing decisions with, a lot of sophisticated, subject matter experts and key stakeholders in some of these areas, you have to start really getting, deep knowledge in the category, service or supply that you're contracting for, to be able to have some level of credibility, right? To talk to these, subject matter experts who've worked in this space for years. And, the way, I approach that is, leveraging experience from, I think, peers at other systems who have done this before. Like I said, market intelligence, there's a lot of great benchmarking resources out there. When you bring facts and data to the table, it's really, indisputable, sometimes when you're trying to drive that decision, right? I think that's key.
I was going to say, Rick, but you'd also hope that the industry itself, the reps, the people coming to you are also rather professional and giving you pretty good advice as well. Not obviously the end all, but they should theoretically be a good resource in that.
That's absolutely correct. Yeah, the external piece of that is crucial, right? Because they're on the forefront of this. I mean, they have, each of their own angles, right? Of selling, the service or supply, and it's up to the sourcing associate to really be the arbiter of truth there, right? To determine where
the judge, jury, and
fact
trial.
and fiction. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, there's a little bit of all of that in there, but the good ones, they do provide a really good service. The really good ones do.
Rick, one of the best practices, and I'm wondering how you do this or if you modify it or you take it to another step, is those calls when those those proposals come in on, indirect or purchase services or whatever it looks like, do you have them walk through with the SME, the key stakeholders, with sourcing and contracting to really poke holes in it, and kind of each one of them staying in their lane to make sure they are separating fact from fiction and really trying to poke holes in that when they have those proposals ready? Maybe an internal meeting first and then an external with the vendors to kind of poke holes in it. Is that kind of the strategy sometimes?
Yeah. Typically it is. We'll kind of coalesce internally, determine where their strengths, weaknesses, and that kind of teases itself out through the evaluation process, right? And then that's when I ask those SMEs to join me at the table, to really focus in on the areas that we perceive as weaknesses, either against the criteria or against their competition, right? And we could really use them, kind of as, again, subject matter experts to really separate fact from fiction and help me kind of more appropriately rank and, kind of apply these proposals to our needs.
Yeah. Gary, you touched on some best practices, around, RFPs there, but you also alluded to something that's really important, which is, engaging the SMEs and managing that internal stakeholder involvement. Because if you get everybody involved, right, sometimes a decision never gets made, but you also have to give them some reason to be engaged. And if you're going to make a change, they got to be kind of on board with it to some degree anyway. They might not get everything that they want, but you're really going to have a hard time executing, on a conversion, especially if you don't have the stakeholders really involved. But it also brings up another kind of sticky widget that I think definitely comes up with purchase services, and probably even more so as we get more value brought into the indirect spend categories in general. And some of it's already there, but it's really about this dynamic that you're going to have between the folks that are providing the service, who are often viewed as a coworker and not a vendor partner, right? They're coming right alongside. The people that are working in the various departments and facilities are relying on them. And then all of a sudden it becomes obvious that, hey, wait a second, this relationship might not be, good for us anymore. And not because even necessarily that the vendor company did anything wrong. Could just be something that is disruptive, that has come into the environment that all of a sudden they're not able to keep up with. But then you're really talking about these human interpersonal relationships. And I want to go to some of the best practices around managing internal stakeholder involvement, very specifically around that unique dynamic that exists so strongly and pervasively in purchase services and indirect spend also.
Yeah.
What people don't know is Hayes is making a lot of funny faces because I just asked a 180-second question.
Someone's going to wake me up on that one. Holy cow.
It's loaded. But
full of it.
I'm ready to respond. Justin, we run into those situations all the time, right? And historically they've been called, kind of sacred cow spaces. I don't know if you could use that term anymore, but they're kind of, embedded relationships, right? That for good or bad, they've have a, very historical, in-depth experience with the stakeholder. So, how, I've tried to combat and approach that is you need to leverage supply chain sourcing as best as, you can. And really the role I think we play the best is the bad cop, right? In that good cop, bad cop kind of scenario play, right? The stakeholder will ultimately, regardless of who's selected or who we end up concluding to award contracts to, will have to work with that company. And, I want them to preserve that relationship through any of these negotiations. So, really I approach it in that, I consider myself a pretty good bad cop. And, I love to be hated, I guess. I've heard, people say that they kind of walk in a serpentine way to their cars at night, right? To avoid some of the backlash from some of the suppliers. I think it's, absolutely crucial that supply chain be the kind of heavy with the suppliers and try to push and pursue an equitable situation for all bidding parties or all bidding partners to offer their best proposal for the supplier service that, we're looking to source, regardless of embedded, historical relationships at Jefferson. So that's kind of the way I've approached it is let us handle the negotiation. You call the balls and strikes on requirements and how they're able to meet requirements, but let us push them on anything else, that needs to be, negotiated. And the good partners, really understand that, and that it's best for the organization. So let them preserve a working relationship, a good working relationship with the supplier and really let us kind of unleash the attack dogs, if you may, right?
I've even seen it sometimes where, a health system will say, we'll convert to you, but you've got to hire the existing team, which is obviously problematic depending on their employment agreements, but I've definitely seen that happen. Have you heard of that scenario as well?
Yeah. I mean, we have, it's not, the optimal way. I, want to work through a negotiation. That's not even some of the wildest things I've heard in conditions on offers. So we can get into those in another podcast. But
is that a whole podcast?
The craziest, the craziest. Let's do it. I think too, Rick. One of the things that I had a question for you too is you get to the closing of this and you have these vendor relationships. You were working like a dog on both sides, bad cop, good cop, multiple conversations with the key stakeholders and the SMEs. But once that agreement's signed, are you trying to put extra appendices or extra language or KPIs or continuous improvement? Are you trying to add that to the agreement versus a verbal in good faith, in the spirit of things? Are you trying to make sure it's in the agreement as well to help support that engagement?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's, crucial when we think about kind of the resource and time that's expelled sometimes post-contract signature of working through problems, addressing issues with the service, and then, everyone throwing up their hands and saying, this isn't working, we have to rebid this, terminate the contract and move on. And then we select another supplier that, has the same related issues or worse. I think getting that addressed up front and trying to manage that partnership, saves, and it sets the lines of expectations for both parties a lot clearer, and it just saves everybody a lot of time through the relationship. And it also saves us a lot of time that if the relationship is working and if the KPIs are met, we don't have to spend a lot of time, kind of looking and pursuing another bid process, because we can enter into, if the pricing is continuing to benchmark competitively, we're happy with the service, we enter into a very simple extension agreement, and it continues to supply, us with quality service at best cost without a high level of effort. So I think that's absolutely crucial in contracting these days.
Glad to hear that. Glad to hear it.
All right. So another area and kind of a fact about indirect spend, is a lot of times they're regionalized suppliers, right? They're not necessarily national, which is why maybe in the past, a lot of the indirect spend's been outside of the purview of your group purchasing agreements, which you talked a little bit about too, Rick, right? Like some of those commodity agreements are there, but some of them aren't. And that's why. But I also know that when you're talking about a team of individuals providing a service and they're physically located in a certain region, you also can get a great degree of variability, even with a national company, from one region to another. And it's why I think specifically in purchase services and indirect spend that business reviews are a critical best practice. I think they're important for all suppliers and all of those contract relationships. Maybe you don't hold them as often when the, kind of the defined terms are pretty clear cut and the opportunity for scope creep around scope and spend is pretty limited and the guardrails are there. But when you start talking about the work that you do every single day at Jefferson, Rick, I think business reviews are absolutely critical to always have a pulse on how's the quality. Is it maintaining what you thought you were getting when you signed the agreement? Do you have any best practices around business reviews and maybe tracking them, managing them, what to expect, from the healthcare side and what to expect from the supplier side when you sit down at the table and kind of review how things are going?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Justin, because and specifically mentioned supplier side too, because I think it's crucial in a relationship, in a business relationship, in any relationship really, to, perform kind of a reverse scorecarding process, right? To see how it's working from the other person's perspective. Because if you're just looking at it, from, for where I sit from Jefferson's perspective, and you're not understanding, what's preventing, what are we doing as an organization that's preventing the supplier or vendor from maximizing market share, from maximizing profitability. We become, at sometimes when we used to, kind of put preferencing scenarios together, we become, as Jefferson, a nuisance account, right? That some of these suppliers just may not, it may not be worth doing business with. And we lose really good core suppliers to our service because they're willing to walk away from the business, or they switch us to their B team to focus where they can grow profitability on other accounts. So I think, that reverse scorecarding process is absolutely crucial to driving those supplier review and quarterly business review meetings and processes. And I use it mostly with all my core suppliers to ensure that we're meeting their expectations through the relationship too.
And I'm willing to bet your past, because you're on the other side of the table, makes you pretty good at that.
I like to think so, yeah, because, you felt kind of the pressures from, some of the clients, and you want to make sure that it's all transparent, right? Because without that level of transparency and trust in the relationship, it completely erodes it, and you're never going to get the value out of the relationship that you expect on both sides.
Rick, great conversation today. I think you'll be shocked to know that we've been talking for 30 minutes. This one flew right by. Some great best practices there. And honestly, you're doing it at a health system that you've, as you mentioned, grew from 3 when you started to 18 now. So I can only, and during that time, I think the sophistication and focus on the category that you manage has also grown. So I can only imagine what your day-to-day looked like when you started versus what it looks like now, and how much has changed and how much more sophisticated, everything that you're doing has been forced to become. So, just getting a little bit of a snapshot into how you're doing it at a really excellent healthcare institution is great to hear today.
Yeah, and thanks for listening to some of my long explanations and drawn out anecdotes today.
Hey, Justin's got the world record. Justin's got the world record for the longest question in the history of power supply today.
We'd much rather hear Rick talk.
Glad I could be the recipient of that.
Yeah, absolutely, Rick. You've been awesome, man. It's been great.
Appreciate you doing this.
Yeah, nice meeting all of you.
And that was Rick Gresko, Vice President of Procurement at Jefferson Health. Gary, I know I saw you nodding. I realized that we don't have the cameras putting out on the video feed for everybody who's listening, but you were nodding the entire time, I want to say, about everything that Rick was talking about around, specifically indirect spend. I know he manages purchase services and there's some overlap there, but standardization is difficult. Knowing the setting, acute versus non-acute. But I think the biggest takeaway for me is, one of the greatest ways to bring value into a commodity is to add support and service, which means people. And it can also be really hard to move on from an agreement due to the people who are providing that value. So it can be a difficult category to manage for certain.
Absolutely, Justin. I was nodding, not like sleeping. I was nodding like game on, game on, game on, keep going. I think we could have had a 2-hour podcast on this, but he threw in spend creep, constructive friction, highest return, setting expectations, just diving into that purchase services arena, which is all encompassing. Indirect spend all kind of roles in that world. And just the knowledge base that he has with Jefferson and what he supports was really pretty impressive on, working with our key stakeholders and our SMEs and the vendors that help support those agreements and those relationships. I think it's a really good podcast today, and I think our listeners are going to be really excited to hear about it.
All right, Rick, you did a great job. Thanks for coming on the show. And on behalf of Hayes, Gary, and myself, everybody out there tuning in today, thank you for listening to this episode of Power Supply.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Power Supply. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing on your favorite podcast app or by downloading the smartphone app on your iPhone or Android. Simply search for Power Supply in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@powersupplymedia.net. We look forward to hearing from you.